All right, and if you are on the Zoom webinar itself, you would just receive a message that this is being recorded. So if you could just click to allow that, that way people who can't be with us tonight live can watch this at a later time. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and get started. My name is Joe Sawyer. I'm the superintendent of the Shrewsbury Public Schools. There are some other folks who are on the call tonight from Shrewsbury Public Schools that I'll introduce to you. We have our principals from the preschool through grade 4 level. Lisa Robinson, who's the principal of Parker Road Preschool. Chris Girardi, who's the principal of the Beal Early Childhood Center. We have Brian Mabey, who's the principal of Spring Street School. Lisa McHubry, the principal at Floral Street School. Tiffany Ostrander, who's the principal of Coolidge School. We have our assistant superintendent for community partnerships and well-being, who is also the acting principal at Patton School this year, Dr. Jane Lazat. Also with us on the call, Meg Belcito, our assistant superintendent for student services. Patrick Collins, our assistant superintendent for finance and operations. Welcome to them, and I also want to welcome on the panelist portion of the call is Sandy Fritz. Sandy is the chair of the Shrewsbury School Committee, and just want to ask her to make some opening remarks.
Thank you, Dr. Sawyer. Thank you for everybody who's joining us. I know as a parent myself, this is an extremely stressful time. There's so many unknowns, and we're thinking about your children and your children's education, and we want to make sure that we hear from you, that we hear your questions, and that we're considering everything. I just ask you to be patient with us because this is something new and we've never done this before. But thank you for joining us, and we hope that we're going to be able to answer as many questions as we can. And we know that as we move through this school reopening, there's going to be more questions and more concerns, and we're going to be here to work with you through every step of that. So thank you for being with us.
Thank you very much, Sandy. I appreciate that. At this point, I'm going to go through a presentation with some slides with some information to try to summarize the reopening plan that the school committee approved last week by unanimous vote. We have some slides that are designed to provide information based on some of the frequently asked questions that have been coming into the email address reopen2020 reopen@shrewsbury.k12.ma.us. Thanks to those who have submitted questions to that. And then we will be taking some questions through the Q&A function of the Zoom webinar as well. But let me first share my screen, then I want to explain a little bit about the interpretation that's available, and then we'll get right into it. So bear with me for one moment. Okay. So I want to provide this set of slides to help with this. The first piece I want to be able to share is that we do have interpretation available, and that is something that is tonight available in Mandarin Chinese. It's available in Brazilian Portuguese and also in Spanish. And if you wish to use the interpretation, if you click on this link, and then you'll be able to choose which language you'd like to have the live interpreter. So we do have live interpretation in those languages this evening. So I want to make sure people are aware of that. I just want to also start with the 3 key messages we've been sharing right along. First, the health and well-being of our students, families, and staff is always our first priority. That we are focusing our planning this year to create a safe school environment for students and staff that prioritizes everyone's well-being and enables high levels of learning for all. And we are planning based on the guidance and the regulations we've received from the Massachusetts Department of Elementary and Secondary Education, while we're also closely monitoring the latest information from medical experts and the evolving data regarding the pandemic, both in Massachusetts and more specifically in Shrewsbury. And I'll speak to that in a few minutes. The goals for this webinar, we're hoping to answer families' questions in order to help you understand our plan as it currently exists. We want to be able to provide enough information for you so that families can make the initial choice for what learning program to select for your children. That's a choice that we're hoping to have made by this Friday, that initial choice. I just want to remind families, you received an email with this information yesterday. Many of you have already submitted your choice, which we appreciate, but you do have, we'd like to have this done by Friday, August 14th at 4 o'clock. We ask that you log into your account in the PowerSchool Parent Portal. There's a blue heading called Fall 2020 Reopening Learning Program, Family Choice of Option. We'll ask that you submit a choice for each of your children, again, by this Friday at 4 o'clock. Want to also let you know, we've had questions about this, that if your initial choice that you make by this Friday, you will have the opportunity to change that choice of program before the school year begins. So you're not obligated to stick with that choice for any period of time. If you do want to change it based on additional information, there'll be an opportunity to make that change sometime, probably in about 2 weeks, but in advance of the school year starting. Also want to let you know, many questions. Probably the number one question we received is, is a student able to change during the year from one program to another, from an in-person program to a full remote program? The answer is yes, but there will be a waiting period for that during the school year, and I'll provide some more specifics to that later. And then this initial choice information, the reason we're asking for this initial choice by this Friday is it's really critical for us to get that information in order to make more detailed plans. We really appreciate your assistance with that and your patience. I also want to start, well, actually, while we're still talking for a moment about the initial choice process, I just want to try to set some expectations. We've had a lot of questions, literally hundreds and hundreds of questions coming in through the email address already. I'm sure we'll get lots of questions tonight through the Q&A function. And this evening, that there's just no possible way we're going to be able to answer everyone's detailed questions tonight. What we will do is we will keep a copy of the Q&A from tonight. We're obviously logging all of the questions coming into the email address, and we are working on a written frequently asked question document that we're looking to get out to you in the next day or two before the Friday deadline, to try to provide as much detailed information as we possibly can to help you make that decision. At the same time, there are hundreds upon hundreds of details that we have to work through before we open school in mid-September. And as much as I would like to be able to answer everyone's question this evening or have our panelists do so, that just won't be possible. What we're going to try to do is hit the big questions that people have been asking, try to provide as much clear information to help you make that initial choice. And as Ms. Fritz referenced earlier, we're going to continue to work through the process of this very detailed planning that has to happen, and we'll continue to update you all along the way. So I just want to make sure we're trying to set some expectations with regard to what we can and can't do tonight. The other important factor is that there are elements of this work that we are responding to some continually evolving guidance from the state that we have to take into account. We're also working with our employee associations because elements of the work that's going to be happening need to be agreed upon between the school district and the collective bargaining units that our employees belong to. So that also is work that's happening in parallel to this other planning work that's going on. So I just want to make sure people have an understanding of kind of the landscape that we're operating under. Before we get into some of the questions, I just wanted to remind people watching of our current situation with regard to the pandemic. I shared this slide last week when we presented our plan. This was presented to superintendents by the Commissioner of Education. You can see where the green arrow, where Massachusetts is below the 5% threshold that's been established essentially by the World Health Organization with regard to when communities or states or nations should be considering being able to reopen various functions of society, including schools. And we are one of the states that has the positivity rate that's below 5% at this time. We know, of course, what we tend to see in the news for the most part are where we're having a lot of difficulties in the South and the West and Midwest in particular. Fortunately, in Massachusetts, we're in a much better place, although, as you know from watching the news, there has been a slight uptick in recent weeks that the governor has been trying to address with some new requirements that have gone into effect as of today. This is a map that actually was just released by the state government today. You can see the black arrow pointing to Shrewsbury. The state is beginning to use a new statistic that, called the average daily case rate per 100,000. That'll be a 2-week average. And you can see that any of the communities that are listed in green have less than 4 cases per 100,000. My understanding is that that is the kind of statistic that the state is looking at from a school's perspective that would be appropriate for full in-person learning or a hybrid in-person learning. And we are recommending the hybrid approach for a variety of reasons, including the space available in our classrooms and able to maintain 6-foot distancing. Communities that are in the yellow or the red are experiencing higher rates of transmission in terms of daily cases. So this is an important statistic that the state is starting to promote as a key marker in terms of the evolution of the pandemic and what it looks like from community to community. In addition to that, for Shrewsbury, the latest information that was posted by the state is the 14-day average was a 1.23% positivity rate. Again, well below that 5% threshold established by the World Health Organization. You can see some of those. This was taken from the Boston Globe website that has a community by community statistics. And then this is the age breakdown that was released by the town of Shrewsbury last week that shows that the percentage of the cases of the 357 cases in Shrewsbury, or at the time this might have been when there were 350 cases, you can see the smallest percentage is for those 19 and under. Some of those are students or children in their infancy who would not be school age, and they're kind of spread across different age levels between birth and age 19. You can see the highest percentage, of course, is in individuals older than 70. This is obviously a very serious disease. We need to take it seriously. I strongly encourage you to follow all the different protocols that the state is promoting in terms of wearing a mask, in terms of minimizing contact in social situations. That is how our state has gotten to a much better situation than other places, and we need to continue to do that. So moving into the summary of the program options that were provided and presented with our reopening plan last Thursday evening. We are recommending two options essentially that we're providing to families, an in-person option and an option for all remote. Those are two options that we are required to provide by the state. We did not provide the option of all students coming back all together at the same time because the size of our school buildings overall just doesn't allow for that and maintaining a 6-foot physical distancing. But we do feel that we can provide that 6-foot distancing we can in our classrooms if we divide our students into multiple cohorts with an alternating schedule. We'll have four cohorts of students. The first cohort, cohort A, would be able to experience in-person learning every day. Full days on Monday and Tuesday and Thursday and Friday, half days on Wednesday because that will be an early release day. And that will be limited to a very small number of students with high needs. And I'll speak to specifics for each of these cohorts in a moment. Cohorts B and C would have in-person learning for 2 days a week. Wednesday is an all remote day for students in B and C, and then 2 days when they would also experience remote learning, the other 2 days of the week after Wednesday. And then cohort D is the choice to have the standalone all remote option, which would have no in-person learning at all. It would be entirely remote from a student's home. So to provide some more details based on some of the questions that have been coming in, for cohort A, we as a school district will communicate directly with families whose children qualify for cohort A. We'll be sending an email to those families, possibly as soon as tomorrow. We expect by Thursday, if your child qualifies to be in cohort A based on their needs. Students in cohort A will include students with individualized education programs or IEPs that are designated as high needs on the IEP document. And these are students with our most complex needs. We also will have some English language learners who are at the very beginning stages of learning English, per state guidance, providing opportunities for them to be in person more frequently. But again, cohort A will only be at the invitation of the school district, and we'll communicate directly with families if you qualify for that. At this time, we have received a couple of, some emails from families saying they would prefer to have their student in school every day. Certainly understand and appreciate that some families would like for that to happen. But at this time, cohort A is not open to families by request. And the reason that cohort A is so limited is because depending on the number of students who are attending every day, obviously that takes up seats in classrooms, and we need to have enough space so that we can also serve the needs of the students who will be choosing to be in cohorts B and C, attending school in person but on an alternating schedule, 2 days in person per week. For cohorts B and C, cohort B will attend in person on Mondays and Tuesdays, and cohort C will attend in person on Thursdays and Fridays. Both of the cohorts together will attend live classes on Wednesday morning via Zoom. And then Wednesday afternoon, their learning will be remote but asynchronous, working on lessons and independent work that's been assigned to them by their teachers. Because each Wednesday afternoon, in order to make this alternating cohort program work, we're going to need our teachers to be collaborating and working together to plan that more robust remote learning programming that we need our students to be able to have in this new school year. So again, cohort B Mondays and Tuesdays, C on Thursdays and Fridays. On Wednesdays, everyone would be remote, live in the morning, and asynchronous in the afternoon. We are planning to split these cohorts by last name in order to provide the balance that we need of enrollment across the cohorts in order to make the numbers work. And also the number one concern was to have families on the same schedule, regardless of what school they may attend. If you have a child who's in one of our elementary schools, but also in the preschool level or the early childhood level or at the middle or the high school level, we want families, children to be on the same schedule. Question has come up, we know we have some families where students have different last names. We will provide that accommodation so that families are placed in the same cohort, and we'll have a specific way that those families can make sure they signal to us that they have that need with children with last names, so we can confirm that. So those students in the same family, regardless of last name, would be put in the same cohort. At this time, we have received some requests from families on asking to be in a different cohort than in the alphabetical designation because they live in the same neighborhood or they carpool together to school. Unfortunately, that is just not a request at this time that we can satisfy. It's just too complex to be able to be moving students back and forth between cohorts based on issues such as that. If there are a situation with a real extenuating circumstance after cohorts have been assigned, and we'll signal to families if you can make a request. But at this time, we need to divide it by last name, with the exception of families, just making sure that families are on the same schedule. So we appreciate your understanding for that. There have been some suggestions to divide the cohorts by geography, but as I'm sure you can understand, the number of students in each neighborhood at different grade level spans just don't necessarily match up. The most efficient and effective way for us to divide these cohorts B and C essentially in half is by last name. Probably A through L or A through K and L through Z, but depending on how many families choose option D, that may shift a little bit in the middle of the alphabet there. So we will make some assignments once we have the data we have from families that's due this week. Other specifics about cohorts B and C. Cohorts B and C will have scheduled learning expectations on the 2 remote days when the other cohort is in person. That's critically important. We're being required by the Commonwealth of Massachusetts to demonstrate that there is a certain number of hours of focused learning time that students will be required to participate in, whether that's in live or remote, and whether that's directly live with the teacher remotely or if it's asynchronous. But there will be a schedule that all of our students have for the days that they are not in school. That will be communicated to students and their families. As I mentioned earlier, we still have many details to work through, and remote learning day content is going to vary, of course, by level depending on the age of the student, from early childhood elementary to middle school to high school. And it may vary week to week and depending on the needs of the program and what the teachers are planning. But the structure is in place that these students will be receiving very specific learning expectations when they are doing their remote learning. At the elementary level, there's also the possibility that all students in a class will be included on the daily morning meeting with students who are at home on those days, joining in the classroom via Zoom in a live way. That is something we're working on being able to make possible. We have to work out some details before we can confirm that, but that is one possibility that we're exploring at this time. However, we have had some questions about the idea of students at home essentially just streaming in live to the class and kind of attending class virtually while the other students are there in person. And based on the work that our team has done to date on investigation of best practices of what actually is effective for learning when students are in a remote situation, our plan right now will not have students at home kind of attending class with the in-person group via video link. That's basically because the kinds of instruction that our teachers provide does not really lend itself to viewing remotely from home. And we're worried that trying to do that would essentially compromise the quality of what we're providing for our in-person students on those 2 days a week, which is going to be just incredibly valuable time for our teachers to have with those students in a smaller group that can be subdivided further into smaller groups in different ways when they're in person, and not be essentially reducing the kind of instruction to the instruction that will only work for students who are trying to tune in from home. So that's not the approach that we're planning on taking. I certainly understand the suggestion that we're getting from parents about trying to attend something like that. Again, for morning meeting, we may be able to make something like that work. There may be some limited ways we might experiment with that in different ways, but at least from the initial stage of what we're doing, that won't be the approach that we're using. That being said, the students who are home on their remote learning days may have live interactions with other staff. Those could include special subjects teachers, special educators, could be paraprofessionals, which could be different instructional aides or tutors who may be making scheduled live connections with them at home. Again, we're trying to provide as much structure to the time that those students are at home. And of course, at the preschool and elementary level, we know these are students who need the most assistance from adults, more so than the more independent middle school and high school learners that we have. So that is something that our planning teams are working on. Don't have all the details of that yet, but we are looking at ways. There will be a much higher degree of structure for the remote learning days than what was part of the program last spring when we were in our emergency shutdown. Teachers will again be providing learning plans for students to complete according to that established academic schedule for them on their remote learning days. For cohort D, and these are the students who will not attend school in person at all, some of this is going to just depend on how many students we need to serve in this way. Possibilities could be that these students could be taught by a Shrewsbury Public Schools educator using essentially the Shrewsbury curriculum. Think of it as a class, an elementary age class, for example, of students who have the same teacher who is only engaging with them through remote means. It's also possible that their class could be taught by a Shrewsbury Public Schools educator or educators, but in order to do that, depending on, again, on the numbers and the volume we need to serve, it might be using a third-party online education curriculum that's aligned with the Massachusetts curriculum standards. And thirdly, we could have a situation where some students who are all remote might be taught or might have their program facilitated by educators from such a third-party online education program. Again, that would be aligned with Massachusetts curriculum standards. This is really going to depend a lot on the volume we need to provide and how we can put together cohorts of students into classes that would work together in a remote way. I do want to make it clear, though, that our plan is that cohort D students will not be taught by the same teachers who are teaching a mix of cohorts B and C, and even some students in cohort A. We are not in a position where our teachers are going to be able to plan for alternating groups of students with whom they'll be in person on 2 days a week each, Wednesday remote, and then making sure they're providing lessons for the kids for when they're home on their remote days. To add another group of students who are only going to be remote for the whole week, it does not seem like a viable option for us. So the expectation is that cohort D students will not have those same teachers. And at the same time, if at some point during the school year, we're forced to switch to an all remote learning program for some period of time, it is most likely that students in cohort D will remain being taught by those teachers that they've had to that point during the year. However, depending on the circumstances, the district does reserve the right to change that assignment if it's necessary. Another important note is that we're providing more specifics later this month as to what the cohort D program will look like, again, based on the data we receive as to how many families wished for that option because they're not comfortable sending their child to school in person. And then depending on the numbers, I want to make it clear that cohort D students with remote classes could be from students from multiple Shrewsbury elementary schools. could be taught by a teacher from a different school than the one they would attend. So there could be blended classes that have students from a couple of the different schools or maybe multiple schools beyond that. Again, it's going to depend on how many students are choosing this option. Our intent is to try to stay school-based where we can, but depending on our staffing options in terms of how many teachers we have available to teach full remote, how many students we have in a particular grade level opting for that, it's possible we might be crossing across school boundaries to create some of these full online classes of students who are in cohort D. I want to get a few of the frequently asked questions that we have before we look at the Q&A chat and try to answer those for you. One question that we're getting probably the most frequently again is, can your child switch from one program to another during the year if you change your mind as a family as to which program you think is best for your child? The answer to that question is yes, you will be able to change. Again, this initial choice we're asking you to make by Friday. You'll be able to change that even prior to the school year starting. We'll provide information on how to do that. Once the school year starts, however, families will be able to change from an in-person program to remote or vice versa, but there will be a waiting period to ensure a successful transition. Those waiting periods could be upwards of 30 school days or so. This is going to depend a lot on where we are in the grading period, finding the opportunity for where physically we could place a child if they're moving from all remote to physical to make sure we have a sufficient desk space. And that if it's moving from in-person to remote, making sure we can assign them to the proper program based on what we have available. We also don't want to be removing students from their learning program right in the middle of a grading period, for example. We want them to complete certain units of study before we move them over to the other program. So again, we don't know how long it would be, but you can anticipate that if you want to switch during the year, there may be a substantial period of time before that switch will be able to be accommodated in order to make sure that the learning program and the student success is the transitions as smooth as possible and as successful as possible. Another question is, if a child switches during the school year from cohort A, B, or C to cohort D or vice versa, will they still be taught by the same teachers? As I mentioned earlier, the answer to that is no. Elementary teachers for A, B, and C will not be planning instruction and teaching students in cohort D. So if you start out in person, for example, and then you decide you want to move your student to full remote, then they will be moved to an online classroom with other students is the plan at this point, because their current teacher won't be able to provide sort of a fourth version of planning for an all remote situation. That's another reason why we have that waiting period during the school year as well. Question of whether attendance will be taken for remote days, and the answer to that is yes. There will be ways in which students will be logging in and demonstrating their attendance during the scheduled portion of remote days according to that schedule, whether they're in cohorts B or C, or they're in cohort D and in a full remote. But attendance is something that's going to be required and will be monitored for our students, whether they're in person or at home. Another question we're getting is, will students receive grades? The answer is yes. They'll be assessed in similar ways to the way that we assess students when we're in normal school. They will receive report cards as well and feedback, so parents will be able to gauge the progress that students are making. There's a variety of ways, of course, that our teachers assess student progress. They'll be sharing that as appropriate with families as they do under normal circumstances as well. But students will have grades. They will be accountable for their learning in that sense. There will be more structure along those lines than there was during the emergency shutdown last spring. And then another question we've been getting a lot is, what will happen if a student doesn't wear a mask? Our plan does require that all students at all ages will be required to wear masks. There'll be very limited exceptions to this. We know that wearing appropriate masks is a really absolutely key part to mitigating against the risk of the spread of the coronavirus. We're going to require masks. The gaiters and buffs and bandanas are not going to be sufficient. This includes from our youngest students in preschool all the way through our high school students. The expectation is that they wear their mask in school. There'll be very limited exceptions based on medical issue, and our pediatricians are telling us that there are very, very limited medical reasons why someone wouldn't be able to wear a mask at all. And then we are going to have some students who have some disabilities that may prevent them from wearing a mask. And again, that will be limited, but beyond those cases, all students will be expected to wear a mask. I'm not concerned that we're going to have students who are just going to refuse to, but refusing is not an option. If there for some reason was a student or their family who just said it's their preference not to wear one and they're choosing not to wear one, those students will be required to be in our full remote program because all students who are in person will be required to wear a mask. And with that, that is the few I wanted to highlight in the slide presentation. At this point, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and we're going to take a look at the Q&A, see what kind of questions are coming up. I'll ask my colleagues to assist me as well with answering some of these. So if you bear with me, I'm going to bring up the Q&A portion. And again, we're not going to get to all of these tonight, but we will be utilizing these in putting together a written document that will be coming out to you in the next couple of days. So I'm going to try to pick out some that are popular in terms of the themes. And I'm going to start with one question is that will the curriculum and the teaching methodology be the same as if kids attended in the hybrid mode? And I'm assuming that means that whether they're in hybrid or they're doing full remote, will they have the same curriculum and will the teaching methodology be the same? And I'm going to start with answering that question. Then I'm going to ask Tiffany Ostrander, who's our principal, who's serving on our curriculum and instruction reopening subcommittee to chime in as well with anyone else. But as I mentioned in the presentation, we did have some, depending on how many folks are looking to go remote, our preference, of course, would be to have all of our students working through the Shrewsbury curriculum with Shrewsbury educators. But depending on our capacity to deliver that to the number of students we're going to choose all remote, we may use some other curriculum materials that are aligned with our state standards that are provided by existing third-party online education programs. In terms of the curriculum standards, of course, are the same. We use the Massachusetts state standards. All of our teachers, use research-based approach. They're very skillful in the way that they deliver instruction. They've been, we're going to continue to provide training for ways to effectively provide instruction both in person in a different way, which will be different, of course, given the limited numbers and the 6-foot spacing. When they're in person, and of course, we're continuing to get better and better at what we provide online and remotely. But teachers have some variety of professional judgment they can use, of course, and what's the best way to get the learning across to students. But I'll ask Tiffany to jump in and anyone else who wants to talk about our thinking around delivering curriculum and the approach we're using instructionally.
Thanks, Joe. One piece is that we do have curriculum coaches at the elementary level who've been working together with classroom teachers on the curriculum instruction and assessment team to identify power standards that we need to scope and sequence throughout the school year. So regardless if you're learning online or in person, you're still going to be receiving the same standard instruction or instruction based on the same standards and goals, I should say. So if your student is in the hybrid model in which they're learning in person, on the days that they are remote, they're going to be viewing asynchronous lessons that align with the content that's being taught in the classroom. So this will be reinforcing information and lessons and instruction and application of what they've learned in person. We'll be continuing to use our content teams that we used previously across all schools at the elementary level to help support our teachers' planning so that the asynchronous instruction they receive remotely is pertinent and again aligns with the scope and sequence. In addition, in terms of the cohort D students, the students who are choosing or whose families choose the full remote path, there's still an expectation that you follow the same standards provided by the Massachusetts Department of Education. So those standards will remain the same even if you choose a remote, an all remote process or cohort.
Thank you very much, Tiffany. In terms of just a couple questions that have come in here, is asking about sort of the switching back and forth between hybrid and full remote, whether that would happen only when report cards come out. Again, our intent is to try to provide an accommodation to switch programs if families request that. It is going to be somewhat dependent on maybe where we are in a grading period or a unit of instruction. That could vary. In some cases, it might be faster than others because of the point in time when the family makes the request. But as a benchmark, it might be as long as maybe a 30-day process. I'm not sure a whole 60-day trimester would be required. I don't think it would take that long. But we just want to make sure we're doing things in a way. We're not going to be able to turn on a dime and just move students between those different programs that easily. So during the year, if a family wants to make that choice, they will be able to make that switch, but it is going to take some time and effort and being planful to make sure it works well for the child and we can do that smoothly. Trying to look at some other questions here with some themes. One question was, if enough students opt out of in-school learning and class sizes are extremely small, will the option of full-time become available? One thing that I can say is that, if we have more students opting for full remote and we have more seats available, then it is quite possible that we might be able to open up option A to more students. So the state has given us some guidelines we need to be considering around how many students are provided with more frequent in-person learning. It might be extended to students who might have, again, some certain challenges with their learning. Might be another group might get to the next layer down, for example, as far as students' needs. But we would certainly look at that. At the same time, if we have more students who are opting for full remote, we may have fewer teachers, Shrewsbury Public School teachers, teaching physical in-person classes and more Shrewsbury Public Schools teachers teaching full remote classes of students. So that would probably may balance itself out a little bit as well. But that's a good question.
Dr. Sawyer, along the lines of the cohort D and all remote, there are frequent amount of questions in this list that ask, will there be 5 days of remote learning for those students, or would they also have 2 days off of learning and 3 days online of remote learning? Is a question that's come up a few times.
Sure. So let me answer that. So first of all, the expectation is that all of our students, regardless of the cohort they're in, are going to have 5 days of learning. It's just a question of if they're in the hybrid model, some of those days will be physically in school, the other days will be remote at home, and they will have schedules and expectations for their learning for an entire school day for each of those days. I think that's critically important to understand. We are indicating that on the Wednesday, when no students will be in person other than cohort A for the morning, that students in cohorts B and C will be receiving live instruction online in the mornings, and in the afternoons when the teachers are collaborating and planning, they would have other learning that's expected of them that's done online, but there will be very specific expectations, as the expectations will be very specific on the 2 days that they're not physically present in school. That could also include some mix of some live interactions with different staff, as well as accessing different learning or using different software programs, all sorts of different approaches that we'll be mixing together to make sure that students are essentially attending a full week of school, but only 2 of those days for most students would actually be in person at school. The other days will be full days of attending school at home, and that'll be according to a schedule. So thank you for that. One question, and it's on people's minds, is the idea of that how will teachers build relationships with students when they can't approach them? How will students have their social emotional needs met when they can't interact with their peers? And I'm just going to start by kind of giving framing a little bit of what Noelle Freeman, our director of nursing, spoke about when we presented this plan last Thursday. And what that really is about is that although there is 6-foot physical distancing, we certainly are going to be students are going to be passing each other in the classroom, in the hallways, and the teacher. There's not going to be a 6-foot force field around every student that never will be breached. And we know that the science is that, what's considered to be a close contact is to be unmasked within 10 or 15 feet, or excuse me, within 6 feet for 10 or 15 minutes. We're going to be requiring people to be masked at all times, and we're looking to have kids spread across the classroom to minimize that close contact. But we do certainly expect that our teachers are going to be creating the best relationships possible with their students through the combination of in-person and remote connections they're making with students. And maybe I'd ask if there's maybe an elementary principal who would like to jump in, or actually Dr. Lizotte, if you don't mind, because I know your subcommittee is working on the idea of well-being and how in social emotional learning elements as well. But in terms of maybe if you could start and anyone else who wants to jump in to talk about some initial thinking about how we're going to be sure that our teachers and our students are making strong connections as far as their relationships.
Sure. We're going to continue to build upon what we have always done at the elementary level and in our schools, and that is to meet with our students in small and large group settings during morning meetings and other times of the day, to greet one another, to check in and set the stage for the day. So whether students are remote or right there in the classroom, we're going to set aside time every day to meet with students and gather as a community, and as well as do that as often as we feel we need to and that students want to check in. We have, over the past several years in Shrewsbury, used some programming called that comes out of Responsive Classroom. It's actually an approach to building classroom community. And that, coupled with some other resources that we're exploring, will assist us as we work to build the connections and the strong, healthy relationships that we know we need to and desperately want to with students. And again, whether the student is right in school in front of us or working remotely from home, we're going to work together as colleagues and collaborate and set the stage for a healthy, happy, and productive day, week, month, and year. So those are just some of the ways that we are going to continue to work to ensure that our students and our children are thriving in our schools.
Thanks, Dr. Lizotte. Any other principals want to jump in on that?
Dr. Sawyer, I just want to say teachers wouldn't have it any other way if we didn't prioritize reopening schools with relationships as the top priority. That's what they're so very good at. It's one of many things they're so good at. In a typical reopening, they will remind us as administrators and content leaders to back off of the academics and let them do their thing those first weeks of school, to build relationships with each other and with their students. We are absolutely going to prioritize that. We are looking at different ways to do that, where you're building relationships between children who see each other only remotely, and with students when they are remote. And they're especially creative at doing that. And they are also advocating for time during some of those, part of that 10-day teacher only or staff only days before the kids come, to dedicate for some shared learning around how do we do that real intentionally, knowing that these are students who have not been into school since March, and they're coming with a different needs than they typically would to transition to a new school year.
Thank you, Ms. McHubry and Dr. Lizotte. I appreciate that feedback. Couple questions here that I'm seeing, about students with IEPs. First question is, are students allowed to choose cohort D if they have an IEP? And the answer to that is yes. All families have the option to choose cohort D and have their students not physically present in school if that is their preference. That's guidance that we've received from the state. That's a requirement we need to provide. But the companion question that someone else asked is that if a student with an IEP opts for cohort D and they're not going to be physically present in school, will they be getting their services from specialized special educators? And so with that, let me turn it over to, and this is a very, very complicated and complex element of the work we're trying to do, but I'll ask Meg Belcito, our Assistant Superintendent for Student Services, to speak a little bit about IEP services in a remote environment.
Thanks, Dr. Sawyer. So The Department of Education in their fall reopening guidance has made it explicitly clear to us that we need to provide students that are on IEPs with the services as designated in their accepted plan. So any student that would be in a remote environment, so if you chose cohort D for your child and they are on an IEP, as a district we'll work with families and talk to them about how to make sure that those services are delivered. Just like during the time of closure, we did have our licensed educators and specialists working with the families. We would do the same. If you were to choose cohort D and cohort D involved another agency that was not the Shrewsbury Public Schools for that type of learning, we are still obligated to ensure that the students receive their special education services. So some of those details are still being worked out. But one thing we really want to make sure that everyone in Shrewsbury knows, we will be working with families individually to make sure that services are delivered the best way possible.
Thank you very much, Meg. Okay, I see there's a few different questions here about sort of what school might look like on the in-person days in terms of how students arrive, enter, go to lunch, go to recess, what some of those different elements would be like. We have someone from the elementary team describe a little bit of what is shaping up as kind of like the physical movement of students around the building and what that looks like in terms of distancing and that sort of thing.
I can take that. So we've been preliminarily talking about what that might look like in, as you can imagine, with some of our younger students, kindergarten, first grade, and second grade, having to learn what 6 feet looks like and having to learn how to keep distances between themselves and others. So what we're hoping to do, or what our plans are to do, is to have signage and markings and hallways and stairs and walls that indicate where kids should be standing or walking in transitions. Same thing for going outdoors to recess. Each building is contemplating different spaces around the campus that can be used for recess areas so that only cohorts of students that are in classrooms are in that space outdoors at one time. We're very fortunate that our plans for the first 4 days of school with students are half days, and that'll give us opportunities to model, demonstrate, practice, and really go through the safety protocols that we need to put in place for many of the things that we've taken for granted, such as lunch, moving a cohort of 10 of 12 kids times 4 classrooms into the lunchroom, 6 feet apart, sitting down, getting their lunch, eating their lunch, picking up, throwing away their trash, and then transitioning back to the classroom. And that involves washing hands before they go to lunch and washing hands when they get back from lunch. So we're grateful that we have the 4 half days before students come back full time, and we have to put those protocols into place that we have opportunities to practice all those. In addition, we have 4 afternoons that first week that faculty and staff will be able to come together to really debrief and talk with each other and brainstorm what were the successes of the day in the practice and the modeling and the routines, and what things can we change or modify a bit to make them better and more safe for faculty and staff. So those are some of the things that we're thinking about that we want to put into place to keep students safe. But just like during a typical academic year, as Mrs. McHugh mentioned, we model what we want kids to do in the classroom, how to handle materials, how to sit in their seats, how to come to the floor, how to line up for lunch. It's a little different this year that there's a few more layers to that there's some pretty specific guidance on what that might look like. So we're working with subgroups and the elementary principals and other groups of teachers that are helping us to develop those plans. And put them into action, but also to reflect that first week of school to see what they look like and how we can make them better.
Thank you very much, Brian. Appreciate it. In terms of continuing on that theme, can people, so maybe another principal talk a little bit about some of the ways in which we're going to try to make sure recess with kids' masks off are going to be appropriate. And there's some questions about, of course, kids are outside then, the guidance we all know very well, all of us experiencing that, 6 feet is the sort of marker when you'd be okay not to have a mask, especially when you're outside. But maybe we talk a little bit about recess because that's coming up in some of the questions as well.
To be honest, it's a challenge. And that's something that we spoke about today when we met. It's going to be natural for kids to want to be with each other, and especially in an unstructured environment. So we're trying to figure out ways that kids can be active and moving, but not breathing too heavily, but getting some of the movement and exercise that they need. And some of that involves, are there spaces around the campus that we can keep a cohort of kids together, 10, 12 kids in a space that is big enough that they can move around. But the challenge is helping kids understand what 6 feet looks like. And, is it arm to arm against each other? Is it hula hoops? Is it, is it some other device that we can help kids understand what that looks like? That's going to be work. And that's something that we're thinking about and processing and trying to figure out, but it's a challenge right now, but we'll get there.
We will, and
Go for it, Jane.
I would just add that having those first, the 10 days of school before the students and the children come will provide us with a wonderful opportunity to share ideas, to learn from our physical education teachers and those who we have staff members who have worked at summer camps, and really, again, to problem solve together and work through some of these challenges. I'm confident we can do that. We have outstanding teams in our schools, but I also know just in observing and talking to some children this summer, they are taking this pandemic very seriously, and I really believe that our children are going to listen and watch their teachers, the paraprofessionals in our classrooms, all of the members of our school communities. And I really believe that they're going to do their best to, follow these new rules and regulations because they themselves want to remain healthy, and they're also want to make sure that those around them are healthy. So that's all I have. Tiffany, you're on.
I was just going to add that Karen Isaacson has shifted into an alternate role for the time being. Instead of overseeing the extended school care programming, she's going to be helping with some of our facilities needs. And some of her faculty will be working with us to help with what recess can look like. Everybody knows how much fun extended school care is, and they're going to be helping us revision what kind of socially distanced games could we potentially have as an option at outdoor recess. And we've even started to talk about it as elementary principals of how can we create like a game of the week to share asynchronously with kids that are at home and kids who are in person to, continue to build community and have fun outdoors.
So, and if I could just add, many of the folks in this room about 2 weeks ago had an experience where we had a retreat where we spent the 2 full days in learning. And we went through the practice of what it is like to wear a mask all day long while in school with your classmates. And I really found the benefit of having those mask breaks, getting outside for a couple of gulps of fresh air was really important. And I think it's important for us to understand that we really don't know what the exact science is of when students are going to need their mask breaks. It's something that we're going to grow into, we're going to learn. We're going to know the differences across levels, what age students may benefit or what class may benefit from their mask breaks when. And I think we'll one of the important tasks for us is to understand where that flexibility lies across the school day, when they're important. I think the first slide here, the first bullet is safety is number one, and I think that's where that really falls. So it was really nice to get a live sense of what that felt like, and then to be able to understand how we can convey that to our staff and to our students and to our families around the importance of getting that mask off for some fresh air, getting outside, getting some exercise. So it was a nice opportunity.
Thanks, Chris. And we'll stick with Mr. Girardi for a moment because there's a couple questions in here about sort of what would kindergarten look like? How does a kindergarten class look in person? And maybe, for some of our younger learners and also Ms. Robinson for preschool, when students are in person for a kindergarten or a preschool level class, how do you see our teachers sort of helping our youngest learners to adapt to that sort of new way of approaching things?
I'll start, Lisa. So again, it's a learning process. It is about socialization first. It's about safety and comfort first. When we talk about responsive classroom, we talk about creating environments that reduce stress and anxiety, that create comfort by learning your environments, learning if you need to use the bathroom, how to ask, learning that if you're thirsty or you're hungry. So it really is a lot of basic need. It's a lot of basic social skills. And this is the same information that we share just every year in our Welcome to Kindergarten orientations is we're not going to be able to do academic learning if our brains aren't ready to be ready for it. Meaning that if they don't feel safe, if they don't feel connected and accepted, they're not going to learn academically. So that's our job number one. I think the question of what does a day in kindergarten look like, it's going to look very different on September 15th than it will on October 15th, than it will in December. And that's a good thing, and that's the learning process, and that's the thing that's beautiful about early childhood education is that it constantly evolves. One thing I'm really confident in is our teaching staff and their relationships with families to get to know who students are and how we can best support them when they are at school. Because there really is some great academic components that we're excited to get to, but we won't get there until that social piece is there. So that's job one. But it will be interesting to see what the 6-foot distancing in students that are confined to their space, because that's not what 5-year-olds do. So that'll be a really important task for us to understand how to build that into our repertoire of teaching students, again, at a high level of learning that makes them excited to come to school every day.
Just to add to what Mr. Girardi was just talking about, I agree completely that we're focused on the social emotional learning of our youngest learners and developing relationships with them, because we want them to love to come to school. For many of our younger students, particularly in preschool, it will be their first school experience. So they're not going to have something else to compare it with. So it will be the norm for them. And it will be adapting to this environment that is new, but yet first for them. And I think that that will be a real gift for a lot of our students. And the materials that we select and we provide to students and how we provision those materials will be done in a very thoughtful way so that it is safe for students and so that they can still engage with the materials that will be developmentally appropriate for them. And there is an early learning team that's part of the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education. And I'm looking forward to receiving guidance that is in process regarding early childhood learning environments. There are districts out there who are sharing photographs of how they're setting up classrooms. So to use the other districts as models will be very important, while first of all, keeping safety in mind first and foremost. At the end of the day, when your child has a day that is not a school day, I would like for them to be asking you, when do I get to go back to school? I love school. Why isn't today a school day? And I know that for parents who even had their students in school 5 mornings a week, that on the weekends, that was a common question. And parents would say, it's kind of driving me nuts. I think that last year we had the opportunity to provide some remote learning for our youngest learners, and that we can keep getting better at that so that our youngest learners can be engaged on the non-school days. And perhaps we'll get to the point at which that's part of the norm at home too. And our students have learned to be more self-sufficient and know what to do on a non-school day. So that love for learning is especially important. And it comes through the connections with the adults, saying hello to every child every day by their name, making sure there's a special person who's connected to them that can reach out to them when they are not physically in school and they are at home, to keep that connection going. Because I know that for students in the past who have attended 2 mornings of preschool, it had been Tuesday and Thursday mornings. Every Tuesday and every Thursday could be like a new Monday for some of our youngest learners. So being consistent with routines and really a lot of modeling will be the norm for our youngest students.
Thank you, Mr. Girardi, Ms. Robinson. I think that those are critically important, how we work with our youngest children and try to have them adapt. And we do know that children are incredibly adaptable, but it's our responsibility certainly to provide the environment and the opportunities and the specific instruction on how to best do these things. Since we're talking about early childhood, there was a question about Beale School in particular. Obviously, what's in the news a lot and what's on people's minds is the whole idea of air quality relative to school buildings. We're very fortunate in Shrewsbury to have an inventory of school buildings that is stronger in terms of newer buildings and renovated buildings than in some other places. At the elementary level, we have a whole variety, of course. And the building that we are scheduled to be in for just 1 more year, because we're building a new Beale School, is the Beale Early Childhood Center at 1 Maple Ave, which was constructed in 1922. And at this point, if I could ask Mr. Collins to comment generally about sort of the air, HVAC systems and what we're doing along with the Public Buildings Division of the town of Shrewsbury in general, and then specifically with Beale School.
Sure. I would just first start and just reiterate that not only do we have in this community has supported the renewal of capital infrastructure of our school buildings, whether it was renovation or new construction, actually put in new HVAC systems at Spring and Patton schools about 3 years ago. So the community has kept up from an investment in infrastructure standpoint, as well as provided ongoing maintenance, as opposed to some other communities which, due to financial resources, have just had to defer. With that said, the Public Buildings Division has engaged some consultants to provide some additional set of independent review. They're going through, these are HVAC engineers and consultants to provide a review of all of our systems and provide us reports to see if there are any kind of gaps. But certainly, the purpose of an HVAC system is simply to bring in fresh air and exchange that air that's exhaled by all the building occupants on a regular and routine basis. And most systems are designed to do this per industry standard, at or about 6 times per hour, a complete air exchange, and including fresh air intake. So, but that's what the consultants will provide us, some written reports and review. And if there's some gaps that we need to address, we'll certainly do that. And we look forward to those reports very soon, hopefully by the end of the month, just in terms of a third-party review. The other aspect of this, of course, is when you have basically a hybrid model, you have 50% of your building occupants at any one time, or maybe even less than 50%. So right there, you're providing a significant decrease in the amount of exhalation, if you will. And that's really just kind of one of the other merits or embedded merits of a hybrid model that's not really visible, but you're providing implicitly kind of a higher degree of air quality with fewer building occupants at half or 50% or less of building occupancy with students and staff. And then finally, Beal specifically, of course, due to his age, we need to, in the public buildings division, is coordinating what is hopefully going to be a temporary HVAC system and bring in basically a vehicle mounted or ground mounted air compressor to provide fresh air with wall mounted ductwork and also ductwork for exhaust as well. So, the goal is to have it in place prior to staff returning. And if that can't happen, certainly by the time students return. But what we do also know is that simply opening the windows at schools or any building really also just provides supplemental airflow. So that's the plan going forward, is to bring on a temporary air solution for Beal School specifically.
Thanks, Mr. Collins. And to continue with you for a moment with operations, there's some questions to hear about transportation. And if a family is choosing all remote at this time and may want to switch back partway through the year into a hybrid model and would want to take the bus, asking about timing, will they be able to sign up for the bus later in the year if they switch their decision from all remote to in person? And sort of this idea, maybe the flip side of that is whether people feel like they have to register for the bus to sort of save a seat, even though they know that they're going to be remote at this point in the year.
So yeah, what we want people who have chosen cohort D to do is not register for the bus to try to reserve a seat. What we really need to do is have an accurate assessment for when we return to in-person learning on September 15th of who we're picking up and transporting into school each and every day. We need to have an accurate accountability of those students. So if you are choosing cohort D, remote learning, please do not sign up for the bus right now. And certainly if you decide to change your mind and subsequently opt for the hybrid model, cohorts B or C, there will be an opportunity at that point of that request to also request transportation services. And given the capacity of our buses, which will be transporting basically half the students under a hybrid model each day, we're confident they're going to be able to provide transportation pretty much to anybody that wants it. There might be a few clusters or pockets of places that we might have to make some certain modifications, but to reiterate, parents who are choosing cohort D, please do not sign up for busing right now. And one of the things that we're going to do, frankly, is compare the bus registrations with the cohort selections and basically kind of filter out those that have opted cohort D and signed up for the bus. We're not going to be reserving seats for those folks at that time. So that opportunity will be provided later if parents are transitioning from cohort, or students are transitioning from cohort D to the alternating model.
Thanks, Mr. Collins. I'm seeing some questions about special classes. What would, physical education, music, art, media, the things that we do for special subjects at the elementary level, and maybe if our elementary principals can help paint a picture of what we're seeing right now in terms of what these things, I know we're still in the planning stages for some of this, but how we might be delivering some of those special subjects to elementary age students.
We know that our allied arts teachers in classes during remote learning in the spring, that was a place where we felt disconnect with our students. A lot of our allied arts faculty were kind of popping in to different morning meeting Zooms and community building activities, but we're unable in the spring to see students in a regular class size. And so that's certainly something we want to mitigate and fix moving forward, whether it's a hybrid model or your child may have a special on their remote learning day, that we want them to be connecting with allied arts educators. we're working to schedule in allied arts on a regular cadence so that students are having their allied arts specials weekly. And that might look different than it has previously. In that we're looking at some different models due to the lunch constraints. It might be that you don't get to see every allied arts person potentially in a week, but you do get to see them over a period of time. But again, we have a few iterations going right now, and if any other elementary principal has anything to add, we know kids love allied arts, and so do we, and we want to be sure that they go. So every student will participate in art, PE, music, and media in a hybrid model for sure.
Tiff, I think I would just add, and correct me if I'm wrong because you're on that committee, that one thing we are feeling is pretty certain is the specialist would travel to the classroom. Give me a nod. Yeah, that's right. Okay, so we're trying to not have lots of students passing from room to room to room within the course of their day. So we are flipping that, and we'll have our allied arts teachers walk to the classrooms, and they'll have their special there. And also, I have a parent, a floral parent in the question box asking about what lunch will look like, especially at floral. I bet you're wondering, because we have a lot of kids. We're using right now, we're planning to use the gym as an additional lunchroom. And I don't know that we've said that yet. So, not ideal, obviously, because we would want our kids to experience PE in the gym, physical education in the gym, but we do need to accommodate our kids having lunch in a safe way. And so I don't think I'm the only building. I think other buildings are also utilizing their gyms for additional lunch space.
Right, and I think we'll try to do some, I'm sorry.
We are also using, and at Coolidge, sorry, there's a toddler, sorry guys. We are also using at Coolidge the gym as an additional cafeteria. We are trying our best to keep the allied arts at the same length of time. So even though allied arts may be happening in the classroom, we're working to have an allied arts be 30 to 40 minutes like it would be in person as well as it used to be.
And I just want to add that there are some very specific requirements from the state, specifically around physical education and around music in terms of choral groups. And I know that our directors of those subject areas, Jeff Lane, our director of physical education, health, and family consumer science, and Tom O'Toole, our director of performing arts, are working with their educators in their departments to figure out ways that we can adapt under these new regulations, whether that's some opportunities for physical education, obviously when the weather's nice, to be able to do some things outside, but also shifting gears and perhaps focusing on some health and wellness issues when they may not be able to utilize the gym space when the weather is not conducive to being outdoors. Just for example, we have to figure out some of the other options around how music will be changed as a result of the state requirements around the health issues with that. In terms of students singing. So again, we're trying to balance things that the state's requiring of us with what we are trying to do and innovate in order to provide our students with the best educational experiences possible. Additionally with that, one of the things that, a shift we've made to provide as much equity as we can in terms of access and to enable, full days of remote learning and not being worried about sharing devices with maybe siblings who might be going to school at middle school or high school. Is that all of our students right now in kindergarten through all the way through grade 12 will have their own iPad issued by the school district. We are in the process of looking at what might be possible and appropriate for preschool, but from K through 12 and certainly all the elementary grades K through 4, students will have their own iPad. There were some questions in the Q&A about students being on their device all day long, particularly on their remote days. Maybe if we could have some principals speak to the idea of kind of what kinds of remote learning might be required of students and how that meshes with screen time, the difference between passive screen time and active screen time. These are things that I think are on parents' minds when, on the one hand, the benefit of having this portal into being able to connect with their educators or with lessons or with all sorts of software and different things that can make learning effective for students when they can't be in a traditional in-school setting. But at the same time, knowing that being on a screen all day has its drawbacks as well. So who would like to jump in first around talking about, remote learning doesn't always necessarily mean a screen, but also the fact that how we're looking to engage kids and make that work well for them.
Can certainly jump in to start, and then people can hop in as well. Screen time is something that the curriculum instruction and assessment team has talked a lot about, and we've done some research looking for medical documentation about screen time connected as an educational tool. A lot of the screen time articles that are available are really more speaking to the use of video games, or students watching television, which is just more of a passive engagement with the screen. So they're watching, they're not responding, they're not reacting necessarily to what they're watching, and that is considered detrimental to their brain development. However, what they're saying is they're beginning to do more research, especially now since schools are happening more remotely due to the pandemic, about active engagement with screens and what the impact of that is on a student. They're saying that it is definitely different when a student is speaking and learning, having small group discussions and breakout rooms in Zoom. Those are ways that kids can be active. When a teacher pauses and actually has students put their head down and really do a math problem during engagement, that's screen time that's considered active. So that is not considered detrimental. There are some other pieces we're still looking into. Having the students seated for a longer period of time can ergonomically affect them. So we do want to support parents. One thing we've talked about with the instruction team is supporting parents with professional development, parent development on how to set up a just right office for your students, selecting the right type of chair. I know that our tech team has been looking at the keyboards that we're using, the functions that we're providing to give you at home to use. So that's a couple of the things that we've been talking about in terms of screen time. But on a remote day, the instruction that your student will be receiving synchronously or live from their classroom teacher, at this time, we are thinking that it would be differentiated. So it would be designed to meet your child's need in reading or mathematics, and then leaving the asynchronous times or the non-live times, the pre-recorded instruction and lessons. Those would be utilized to teach content that has already been taught in the in-person model, to have you apply and continue practicing skills you've learned in person. But anything live would really be more focused on what your child needs, specific to assessment data that we've collected, whether in school, online, or through formative assessment, through looking at their instructional materials.
And to work off that, Tiff, I know that your team is working hard to find materials that are outside of the iPads as learning tools, manipulatives, different types of hands-on activities that will come and go with students each and every day, so that if they are home, they have access to the same materials outside the iPad that other students typically would have just in the school. A quick aside from that is, I think one part is the academic component. One thing that I learned to be really important back in the spring was the devices were really important for connecting students to a community when they weren't at school. And having that equity of all students having their device to be able to connect to their class, to their teacher, to feel that they're part of that school community is critical. And I just am really grateful that we have that opportunity where all students will have that device. It's now up to us to create that kind of just fit way of going about what learning looks like in a way that makes sense for 5-year-olds or 10-year-olds or 17-year-olds. And they'll have their unique needs, but that's certainly work that I'm excited to do, because I know that all students have the access to that.
I'd just like to add that we know young children learn through play, and our teachers are being very thoughtful. They were thoughtful in the spring, and it developed more during the summer, thinking about what it is that you can use at home to engage your child in play and in hands-on experiences that would not be hard to find. And we're also looking at creating toolkits, and we're coming up with some different names for that students could bring home. So if you could imagine that your child may bring home his or her individual Lego set for building at home, that would be a hands-on experience that we would help parents understand the why. Why is my child engaging with Legos? So having opportunities for that parent participation in different training sessions about the importance of play and how to play with your child, because it's really, it's not always easy to play with children. They don't necessarily want to follow the rules and they want to make up their own rules, which is great. It's a great learning experience. So that will be really important too. In the classroom, the materials provided, being able to clean them appropriately, and then for children to also bring them home to engage with them more than one time, because we know that that's fairly important work for them to be doing.
And Joe, may I add, also, we know one thing we heard loud and clear in the spring from parent surveys is student independence can be a challenge. Certainly being sure that your first grader or kindergartner is on a Zoom at a specific time is really difficult. So connected to what Chris was saying about making, now that kids have their own iPad, we can support them during the school day when they are in person to set up reminders, to see if students can log themselves into Zoom, to really do some digital citizenship work with them, because they didn't have iPads previously in the school setting. We had maybe 5 in a classroom and we all shared it. The teacher helped get you online, logged you in where you needed to be. But now we know we need to grow in student independence there. So that's something we're definitely focused on, or will be focused on, especially at the start of the school year, is working on student independence and growing those executive functioning skills that they didn't necessarily need previously.
Yes, that'll be key. Before we wrap up, and I appreciate the time everyone is spending, we're almost at the hour-and-a-half mark here, and we may go a little bit past that, but not much longer than that. And again, we'll take the questions that are in the Q&A, and that will inform the written FAQ we'll put out there. I do want to ask, I know some of the schools talked about utilizing gymnasiums for some of their lunch spaces, and I know there was a question about Patton not having it, it has a dual space for both the cafeteria and the gym. And I think we're looking at some other potential spaces within the school to repurpose for some additional lunch space, but I'll ask Dr. Lazat to speak to that briefly.
Sure. Thanks, Joe. So we will be using our cafegimatorium for lunchtime, as well as looking at a couple of other spaces in the building that are not being used as classroom spaces or spaces for some of our other students who need them. So one thing that we have talked about that is to expand our lunches to hold more than the 4 lunches we've held in the past. So by increasing the lunch times by a half an hour to 40 minutes, we're confident that we will be able to distance the way that we need to in our cafeteria space. We're also taking some measurements on Thursday in the cafeteria to see if we can add additional desks and tables for students to sit at. But right now, it looks most probable that we'll just be extending the lunch hours to accommodate the social distancing that we need for our students at Patton. So more to come, but we're working out on those details now.
Great, thank you.
You're welcome.
Been a couple of questions about half-day kindergarten, full-day kindergarten, how that works, in preschool and how that works. What I can say is that we did announce last week that we would not be asking families to pay tuition, because this program, even the hybrid program, is not in essence providing a full day in-person experience for full-day kindergarten. And the school committee and the administration felt that it wouldn't be fair to be charging that tuition for that level of experience. As far as half day and full day, all of our kindergarten students, regardless if they qualified through the lottery for full day or through their needs, or if they were in the half day list, if they choose cohort B or C, if they choose hybrid, they're going to receive the same amount of in-person learning, those 2 full days in school per week. So there really isn't any difference, and that shouldn't sway which option you choose. If you want to choose to be full remote, that's of course your choice as a family. But if you're in kindergarten and you choose the hybrid, regardless of whether you're a half day or full day assigned student, you'd have the same amount of time. In terms of the preschool, what we're looking at right now is we're waiting to see how many of the families are choosing full remote before, we would like for all of our preschool students to be in school full time, whether those are students who require preschool because of their special needs, or those are students who are would be paying tuition for the experience. And depending on those numbers, we'll be able to know exactly how many students we'll be able to accommodate. So preschool student families, we appreciate your patience. But we would like to know now, if you're not planning on sending your student in person, please choose the cohort D option, and that will help us make more specific plans for preschool. So those are some information about kindergarten and preschool. In terms of the other questions, some people are asking about whether there'll be an in-person orientation for students to meet their teachers. That's still to be determined. There may be some time during those 10 days prior to the first student day of school. We may have some different kinds of orientation. I know our principals are thinking about ways to help familiarize students, especially those who are brand new to the school. So that's on our mind, so stay tuned for more information about that. There are a number of questions about health and safety relative to if a student is found to be positive for COVID, or there's a close contact of someone, what will the requirements be for quarantining, what will be communicated. We don't have Noelle Freeman with us this evening. What I would suggest to families is to read that section of the plan. We do need to respect confidentiality if we're communicating about any positive cases, if we were to experience them. But because close contacts are defined as essentially being 10 or 15 minutes in person with someone within 6 feet without a mask, we'll be looking at, if we believe there was any reason for a student to be noted as a close contact or not. And we would be, our nursing staff would be handling those kind of communications with families. We'll be as transparent as we are able to be when it comes to that information. I think it's important for families to feel reassured based on what's happening, whether there's cases that are emerging in the schools or not. I think we've all seen that in the news. We're finishing our 4th week of in-person instruction in our summer special education program. The staff in that program have done a remarkable job working with those students. And those are students who critically needed to have in-person instruction. And I'm absolutely thrilled that they were able to be provided with that over the last month. We're wrapping that up this Thursday for their summer programming. And, we've been able to make these protocols work so far in that. It's been a good initial run for us in terms of having in-person students and working with issues with staff and nursing and all those pieces. So we're paying particular attention to all the different safety guidelines that have been given to us by the state and through public health. And again, we're monitoring all these things very closely, and we'll be sure to continue to put information about that out as we get closer to the start of school. And then as far as another piece, I do want to ask and see if someone can help us with this. Well, actually, I can speak to this as well. So there was a question about, well, maybe the principals can help with this a little bit. The question about the remote learning days, whether you're in cohort B or C or cohort D, kind of what the mix might look like in terms of live interaction with staff and what would be asynchronous learning. That would be more independent learning with the student engaging with materials that are either online or as we mentioned earlier, some kind of other, whether that's books or hands-on materials, whatever it might be. Maybe if our principals could give a little bit of a framing of on those days students are home learning remotely, what's that mix look like from our perspective, at least at this point?
I can take that one, Joe. So we, if just to walk through the day of a life of a student who is remote, let's say it's Monday and I'm a C student. I'm in cohort C. I'm not at school today. I would log in to morning meeting, likely at 9:15. We're going to be providing an extended arrival time for students coming in person. So at 9:15, I would log in to a morning meeting with my teacher, my classroom teacher, as well as the other kids who are there in person. We do a community building morning meeting greeting. I would then log off. My teacher probably would have gone through, here's what the agenda of the day looks like. And I would be following a pretty similar schedule to what my classmates in person are doing. So if my teacher's teaching reading in the morning, I'm doing the asynchronous reading lesson that was provided to me. We are going to try our best to do what we did previously during remote learning to give parents plans in advance. So you should have your plans the Friday before, like you had previously. So the student would then have their asynchronous reading lesson. The teacher would be teaching reading in person. When they had a break, a snack break in class or a mask break, that would also be something that was built into your remote learning day schedule. Same thing with lunch. Any type of interaction on the day when your child is not learning in person would be likely from a paraprofessional or an allied arts educator. It's also possible that if your child has any additional services that they had accessed previously in school, whether that's from a special educator, an English language teacher, Title I tutoring, that service could still be provided remotely. So your child may sync in and receive 30 minutes of guided reading support from a specialized teacher. And then in addition, your child will probably engage with some type of instructional software. And that information helps us, again, as educators, because we can, it's differentiated to kind of grow with your child. It ebbs and flows with math and reading based on their skill level. And it provides us with data regarding their strengths and areas for continued improvement. And then additionally, teachers will have an option to do a closing circle where they might have all the kids come back and log in at the end of the day to say, hey, what went well today? Where might you have gotten stuck? And set some goals for the next set of learning days. So it's possible that would be another synchronous classroom community opportunity. But the content on those remote days would be asynchronous videos. So that their student would have some learning, but again, it might include, hands-on manipulatives that were given to your child while they were on their last in-learning in-person day. It's possible that, Genius Hour could be something that is included again in remote learning. We've talked a lot about choice boards where there are must-dos, but also provide choice to students and include allied arts choices in there as well, so that we get more physical activity, especially on those remote days. So I think that's it in a nutshell.
Yeah, no, that's a great, thanks for the description. And I think, what we're looking at right now, and again, we don't have all the details of what cohort D's remote learning days would look like, but we would expect there would be some sort of mix of live instruction and asynchronous instruction like Ms. Ostrander just described. And again, the more we can flesh that out, we'll keep providing that as we provide updates over time. We're going to wrap up here in just a moment. I do want to answer a question. There was a question about the potential third-party providers and how they might be vetted. The State Department of Elementary and Secondary Education did a request for proposals, and there's actually 4 different providers that the state has selected that we can access. 2 are virtual schools that have operated in the state for some time, one out of Greenfield and one that's known as TECA, that we could essentially engage them on a sort of an a la carte basis. And then there's also that it could include actually using their teachers if we needed that. There's also a couple of programs, one called Edgenuity and another that's the Florida Global Virtual School. They've been pretty major players in the online learning space in recent years. They have curricula. All 4 of those providers have curricula that are connected to the Massachusetts state standards. And again, there could be a combination of using some of their learning materials as online information and processes that could be coordinated by a Shrewsbury teacher or potentially a teacher who belongs to one of those organizations. But it really depends on the number of families that are choosing that all remote. But certainly it's going to be, these are all companies that have been vetted by the state and that we obviously are paying careful attention to now in terms of who we might engage with. That's a process that's ongoing right now. Again, we don't know if we'll need to utilize those, but if we do, we'll be very careful in making our selections. There was some questions about what happens if my student's in a hybrid. and they get sick and have to be out of school for a while, not necessarily with COVID, of course, but they have a typical illness. I think we're better set up than ever before to provide ongoing learning for students who might have to be out for a while because they're ill. And certainly, we wouldn't be switching them to the full remote cohort D just because a student's out for a week with a difficult cold or whatever it might be. But we'll work through that like we would during normal school and make sure teachers are staying connected with the student, that they're making up work as needed, and not expected to work at home if they're not feeling well, because that's not fair either. So we'll definitely work with families on that if those situations come up. So with that, we have a lot of questions. Again, we'll push out an FAQ to you as soon as we can, but before the Friday choice date. Really appreciate people who attended this evening and who added so many questions to the Q&A. Those of you who sent questions ahead of time in email. Again, I'm sorry we couldn't answer everybody's questions in detail this evening, but we will work to give as much information as we can to you both this week and as we go forward. And I guess I would just wrap up by, first of all, thanking all of our panelists for their assistance, our principals, our central office administrators for helping us with answering these questions. And I just want to thank all of our families. This is really an enormously difficult time. I mean, some people are putting in the chat, just questions and comments about, family where the parents need to be working outside the home. It's a really challenging situation to have young children who can't be in school for the entire week. And I and our team, we all empathize with you. It's a really, really difficult situation for parents, as it is for our staff members who are parents as well, given that the childcare options that are normally in place, or if students are school age, the school options they would have that would take care of keeping them in a safe place physically while parents are working. That's a really terrible aspect of this pandemic. We are striving to get students to in-person learning at least some days of the week because we know it's good for students. We know that there are a lot of reasons why students connecting in person with their teachers are a good thing for them. And it does relieve the burden partially for those families. But we cannot sugarcoat the fact that this is an enormous challenge for a lot of families. And we do empathize and sympathize with those situations. And based on the public health situation we have and the space we have available, right now we just don't see any way that we can provide in-person learning 5 days a week to all students who would want it. Excuse me. So again, it's a really very difficult and tricky situation for people to navigate, and we appreciate that. And that said, we respect the choices that families are making. We know that there are a variety of comfort levels that families have with having your child in an environment where they're going to be interacting with other students and staff members. Just as many families make different decisions about your comfort level about going out into the community at this point in the pandemic. We do believe, the public health experts and the medical experts are saying that it is safe to have in-person school at this time. If we're following measures such as wearing masks and physically distancing, taking those precautions. And we do think the benefits of students being in school are very substantial. But at the same time, if you're families who are not comfortable with that at this point, we absolutely respect your choice to choose the full remote option at this time. There's some questions in the chat about, are we going to try to get all kids back in person at some point, or all kids into hybrid? I would love nothing more, and I am already predicting that the favorite day of my career is the first day that we're back in school under normal circumstances with everybody physically there. I hope that's sooner rather than later. We can't predict when that's going to happen. And in the meantime, I absolutely can tell you that we are going to do everything we can as a team, as a school district, to provide the highest quality education we can for your students under the circumstance, the best connections with educators and support staff that we can, the highest quality learning experiences we possibly can. And at the same time, it is going to be an imperfect process. We're going to try some things that will work well. We're going to try some things that won't work, and we'll have to rethink them. And I'm going to ask for your patience. I'm going to ask for your flexibility. I'm going to ask for your grace and ask for your ongoing support because this is something we need to do entirely together as a community. So again, thank you for tuning in this evening. We appreciate your help. This will be recorded and rebroadcast and be posted on our website. And again, we'll get some other information to you as soon as possible. So thanks to all of our panelists, and everyone have a good evening.